So I want to end our discussion on pain by going a little bit broader, and that is talking about neuromuscular control after injury. Now, this can occur in the absence of pain, but it's believed that pain also plays a large role in the lack of neuromuscular control. So we're going to talk about it here. So after an injury occurs, we know that there can be changes associated with neuromuscular control and muscle activation. And we've seen this a lot after surgery in particular, right? And so in this case, the video on the left here is shot immediately prior to surgery. And the video on the right is immediately after surgery. And the important thing to look at here and understand is they actually did not do any structural changes or make any real changes in the knee. It was a knee scope, supposed to be a simple meniscus surgery. But when they went in, they found that there was no problem with the meniscus. So they basically just did the scope, and 5-10 minutes later came out. And so there was no damage, no change really to the knee, short of some swelling because they pumped the fluid in there. So you can see the quad set here on the left, where as she contracts, you can see a good formation now of that vastus medialis and the entire quadricep musculature. Compare that now to the one on the right here. And you can see, even though she's trying, you can see some slight movement in there. You can't see that same activation. And again, nothing has changed structurally to her knee except for some swelling that's in there. And we see that in research cases as well, where we can just simply inject fluid into a person's knee and immediately shut off their quadricep muscles. And so when we look at this from the point of view in rehabilitation, we're looking on this right side here, where our goal is to restore control of volitional muscle contractions, the ability to contract the muscle when we need to. From there, we want to restore our reflexes, and then finally our complex functional movements. And these are occurring at the same time. You can see here that as we're restoring range of motion, we're restoring strength and endurance, so that way they all can come together for complex functional movements. So when we look now at this, right, neuromuscular control is going to be all three of these. First, volitional control, reflex responses, and then the complex functional movements. Right? As I said previously, loss of neuromuscular control happens rapidly, whereas muscle atrophy is at a slower process when it's not used for time. So that decrease in strength has nothing to do with muscle atrophy immediately after surgery or after injury, because the muscle takes time to actually decrease in size, which is muscle atrophy. It is muscle activation that causes the decrease in strength. And we'll see how that occurs here in a minute. But knowing that early motion, right, following injury is important to get that muscle firing and activating again, will show us the biggest increases in muscle strength early on. So let's look at what we're really talking about and define some terms, right? Volitional control is the ability to activate motor units for recruitment. And remember, a motor unit now is a single motor nerve and all the muscle fibers that it controls. Strength, on the other hand, is the ability of the muscle fibers themselves to produce force, as well as the ability to activate motor units. So when we look at volitional control, we're only talking about half of strength, but it's an important half that often gets overlooked. So when we look now at strength, right, and both components, we have to look then at that all or none principle. So a muscle fiber is going to contract maximally, or it's not going to contract at all, right? And a motor unit is going to contract maximally or not at all. So when we say we're going to lift at 50% strength, we are not using our entire muscle and only producing half the force, but we would be only producing half the force through activating only half of the motor units, or motor units responsible for the control of 50% of our muscle. So when you increase strength, you can increase the muscle fiber's size, right, which is hypertrophy, which will then increase their ability to produce force, or we change the activation of motor units. This is also why you see increased gains in strength when you start a new workout right away. Not because your muscle hypertrophies and can produce more force, but instead can activate more motor units. The term we use to describe this difference is arthrogenic muscle inhibition, right? Sometimes you'll see this as arthrogenic muscle response, because in some cases we will see facilitation. But for the most part, we're going to talk about inhibition because that's more problematic for us. So this is the ability of a muscle to contract, right? But it's compromised due to a joint injury. So if there's swelling, pain, altered mechanoreceptor input, we're not really sure exactly how all of this works, but we do know that there are these inhibitory neurons that work to make it so that our motor neurons are not able to depolarize after injury. And so we can see that graphically through different ways that we go about testing this in a research environment. And the first is going to be the Hoffman reflex, shown up here. And how the Hoffman reflex works is you have a stimulator, right, that you put over a nerve. And you put it over a nerve now where it's proximal enough that it's a mixed nerve. It includes both afferent and efferent nerve fibers. And so when you stimulate this, right, and you use the stimulator and you put the electrode on there and you depolarize all of the nerves, you're going to immediately send a signal now down to the muscle to contract, right? And that's immediately going to occur, right? Then you're also going to send a signal through the afferent fibers that then reflects again back with the efferent fibers and cause the muscle to contract again. The difference is when you're going through the spinal cord, those inhibitory interneurons are then going to create a situation now where that inhibition decreases the response that we get. And this gap then is called the muscle inhibition. It's a little bit easier to graphically see in a more functional, because this is all passive, this is active, where you are contracting. This is a force cell here, and you're doing a knee extension as hard as you can against that, and this is the force you see. Once you plateau, right, this plateau is your maximal voluntary contraction, the ability of your muscle to produce force as is, right? Then through these large electrodes, it depolarizes the rest of your motor neurons and you get a little bit extra force. And so this gap then is the inhibition, right? And so sometimes when you hear of, like superhuman strength or tapping into strength reserves, the grandma lifting the car off of the injured child, they're tapping into this inhibition, right? And your body naturally inhibits your muscles to protect the tendons and the muscles themselves, right? So we're controlling the amount of force that it can do. After injury, though, the maximal voluntary contraction would decrease and would be down here, but the superimposed burst would stay the same. So looking at this then just from a perspective here, we have now C is the potential. So if this is 100% of our motor neuron pool availability, right? B then would be the reality, the normal component. So you can only activate this amount. And then lastly, A is an inhibited amount. So this would be considered full strength at 60%. This would then be the potential strength in theory. And so understanding this idea of motor neuron pool availability and excitability is important in understanding what we call volitional control. But volitional control, like I said, is only part of it. So let's take a look now at the next part, which is proprioception and reflex. And we'll look at this video here together that explains what this is.
Proprioception, never even heard of it, so how I lost it I don't know. The complete, well, hey, what's that? Very scary stuff. I was working in Jersey about 30 years ago as a butcher. Got what I thought was flu and gradually got weaker and weaker and weaker and was eventually taken into hospital and woke up the following morning with no ability to control movement. I still had movement, and I could move an arm and I could move a leg, but I had no very fine control over that. The consequences were that I couldn't control my body without looking at what was happening. It wasn't for some time that I found that key, that I had to associate vision with picking up feedback.
Ian is one of fewer than 15 people in the world who have no proprioception. He has no sense of touch below the neck, and he's unable to sense where his limbs are or how they're moving. With the help of neurophysiologist Jonathan Cole, he's become the only sufferer from this rare condition to regain his mobility.
Ian has lost this odd thing called proprioception, which is the sensation of movement and position sense. So that if he doesn't look at an arm, he doesn't know where it is.
When you stand and when you dance, you don't necessarily think about where exactly am I in time and space. I have to think about all the processes that go on behind that, developing the movement. Am I safe? Am I in the right position?
And then slowly he realised that if he looked at a moving part and then thought and willed it to move, he could control that movement.
It took me an awful long time to learn just to stand. And I even say that today, one of the toughest things that I have to do is to stand perfectly still. It was very, very difficult to learn the concept that if you put an arm out, you'd go that way. That's what things do. So I had to lean slightly that way. And they tried to use mirrors, which you use as a dancing field. And I tried that, but I just couldn't work it all together quickly enough in my head. So I very quickly gave up the mirrors and just concentrated on looking down, which is why I walk in the way that I do, which is inclined forward and looking down, so I can catch my whole body, so I can monitor and control and look at what's happening.
You're literally dependent on being able to see your foot so that you know it's done the right thing.
When you're walking down the road, you don't think about every step that you're taking. I do, otherwise I lose touch with where things are. And when we were walking over the Millennium Bridge earlier, I had to stop and admire the view rather than just sort of like glance up as I was walking along, because to have glanced up would have taken the feedback that I require away.
So if you close your eyes
If I was to close my eyes, I'd stay in this position. That's quite an easy thing to do. I'd freeze certain muscles and freeze into a posture. But if we go back the 25 years or so when I was first disabled, if I was to close my eyes for more than a few seconds, I'd fall over. I hadn't learned these strategies of freezing the tummy muscles.
I think I'm understanding what you physically have to go through, but what is the neurological explanation for what Ian's going through?
There are peripheral nerves that go to the skin, go to the muscles, go to the joints. And some of those are movement nerves, so when they fire, bits of you move, and some are sensation nerves. In Ian, he had an infection, and he raised an antibody which actually attacked the nerve cells and wiped them out. Just the sensory nerves conveying touch, movement and position sense.
So you can send messages to your body in exactly the same way as me, but you don't get the message back which tells you what you've done.
Yeah, I don't get the acknowledgement saying, yeah, that's right, you got it right, now move on to the next stage.
So you can see here how proprioception then is the ability to understand your body's position in space. And this is disrupted, obviously, after an injury where, the mechanoreceptors in the ligaments that are torn or muscles or whatever are not able to sense stretch anymore because there is no more stretch because it's been torn with that. And so when we think of this, right, that's the difference between proprioception and neuromuscular control. Again, neuromuscular control includes proprioception, but proprioception does not include all the different aspects of neuromuscular control. But part of proprioception then as well are the reflex components there, where we get the sensation of stretch and then immediately activate that opposite side, right? And the muscle then that can resist that force. And so when we've got a situation where we've got decreased proprioception in there, we're going to have decreased reflex response. So we have to compensate for that. We're obviously not going to lose all of our mechanoreceptors. There are mechanoreceptors in the skin, for instance, that can compensate, but we would have to train through that to have increased attention paid, right, and subconscious attention to the mechanoreceptors in the skin if the ligament mechanoreceptors have been damaged. And so part of the restoration of neuromuscular control is restoring the proprioceptive feedback loop to the reflexes, right? And you're not going to restore it from the standpoint of actually restore what was lost, but restore that input from a different point, similar to how in the video he had to use vision to create the situation where he would then get the feedback he would need on where his body was in space. Instead of using the ligament mechanoreceptors, we would be using the skin mechanoreceptors to get that feedback and then initiate the reflex response. The next component and the final component of neuromuscular control are complex movements. And so let's take a look now at complex movements.
What is muscle memory? This might sound like a simple question, but in actuality it's far from simple. For starters, there's no such thing as memory stored in muscles. Muscles are merely the motors that pull on the skeletal system to create physical movements. In actuality, coordinated muscle contractions are initiated through electrical stimuli that come from several areas in the brain, which work in concert together to create a movement that is integrated into a particular environment to ensure task completion. And since human brains are designed to work best when focusing on a single task, our minds are always trying to maximize its attention center. It can do this by creating memories that can be instantly accessed for simple tasks like motor functions, such as walking, driving, or throwing a ball. Once a memory has been formed, a person can instantly, smoothly, and accurately repeat these physical tasks with little to no mental effort. These memories, which are stored and accessed in the brain, are what most people call muscle memory. But in the scientific world, these processes are referred to as a schema, a procedural memory, a discrete motor function, a stored motor task, or what I like to call an automatic neural pathway. The initiation of an automatic neural pathway starts in the frontal lobe, which is the part of the brain that makes you, you. This is the area that contains your thoughts, strategies, motives, and decision-making center. This is where you decide on a physical task. Inside of your frontal lobe is the premotor cortex. This section of the brain contains a drop-down menu, so to speak, for all of your automatic neural pathways. These memories are essentially the easy buttons of life. Once a memory is picked, a systematic set of commands fire through your motor cortex, which is the part of the brain that actually generates the body movements needed to complete a task. However, the process doesn't end there. After an automatic neural pathway has been activated, the real powerhouse of the brain takes over, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is 1/10 of the brain's mass, but contains 50% of the brain's neurons. It's the automatic center of the brain that controls things like breathing, digestion, and heart rate. The cerebellum also controls balance, muscle tone, and systematic coordination. And coordination is the key to completing any complex movement. You see, working in real time on unperceivable levels, the cerebellum continually tracks the current location of every body part and directs it where it needs to go to complete a selected task. It receives instant updates from sensory neurons and sends instant corrections to the outer extremities through motor neurons. The cerebellum also has the ability to create its own systematic memory for automatically directing body parts. This is why a person can walk, text, and chew gum all at the same time with no mental effort on at least 2 of these functions. Now, this is an oversimplified map of procedural memories, but it works well as a foundational understanding of an automatic neural pathway, or what most people call muscle memory. Using this as a platform, we should be able to create an experiment to see how many physical repetitions and how many days of practice it takes to create an automatic neural pathway.
So they're looking at that as the culmination of neuromuscular control, right? Those automatic neural pathways that you obviously need to be able to contract the muscles volitionally, right? So you have to be able to contract and activate those motor units when need be. That's the first part, right? You also need to be able to get the reflex and the feedback from the proprioceptive system to allow then for the cerebellum to be making those changes. And so you can train this through the new activities, right? After an injury, there's going to be a different automatic neural pathway that needs to be formed to control for the difference now that's caused by the injury and the change in how the body functions. And so next, let's move on to why neuromuscular control is lost. And again, this is not very well understood. We're more looking now at situations where we have found changes in neuromuscular control, or we've found muscle inhibition, and then trying to come up with reasons why that may be the case. But the 3 biggest ones that we have seen are swelling, pain, and joint instability. It's proposed that after swelling, to protect the joint itself, you have the stretch receptors that are going to come down and inhibit the the muscles to decrease the amount of force and movement in that joint to protect it. Right? So this is a protective mechanism, makes sense. The problem is it lasts too long, as everything does with that. And so that's the idea there. Pain occurs in the same sort of realm, where if there's pain, the body inhibits the muscles there. And then joint instability may have to do with the amount of feedback that is occurring. And so regardless of exactly how it's occurring, as far as what specific nerves are being activated and the specific pathway that's occurring here, we do know that swelling, pain, and joint instability do create a lack of neuromuscular control. And so going back now to these videos, we can see what occurs immediately afterwards here. So we've got the good muscle tone on the left, lack of muscle tone on the right, and a change in neuromuscular function. So now we need to focus on how we can go about restoring this neuromuscular functioning, because it's different than just restoring strength. And the biggest difference now is we need to create a situation where we are increasing the availability of motor units, opposed to just hypertrophying the motor units that are available. So if we look here now, and this isn't a perfect representation, because this is looking now just at normal versus inhibited. But the same thing applies. If we're in an inhibited state and we don't ever move to a normal state, then the motor units, in this case, red represents available motor units, gray represents the inhibited motor units that cannot be used. And so regardless, you'll see in all of the different reps, right, on the inhibited side, those motor units are never activated because they are inhibited. And it's a rotating thing. It's not perfect. Again, this is just a representation. But in this case, right, with the inhibited, if you never are able to activate these motor units, you would never be able to get hypertrophy in those. So you might increase in strength, but you would be increasing in strength only in the activated motor units. But at that same note, you can see how you fail so much quicker with that. And so you have this perceived lack of strength, right? And it is a lack of strength, but it's a lack of the neuromuscular control portion, because how you get your strength is through the rotation of these and not using all of them. In a low rep component, like I said, a motor unit is going to contract maximally or not at all. So in this case here, you can see we're only activating the motor units in blue for this first rep. Then those are recovering. So they're in pink here. And now we're activating the same number of motor units, but they're in blue. Same here now. So now we've got two sets of motor units that are recovering, a third set that's being activated. All right, still have the inhibited component there. Now we get to a situation where we have more of them active. All right, some almost ready, or these are in use. These are have been used. These are then almost ready to be used again, but in this case, we ran out because we needed to tap in to some of those inhibited motor units. This occurs even faster, obviously, the more percentage of motor units we are using. So we can see here, if we're just strengthening, right, and not addressing the overall inhibition, we will increase in strength, but we won't ever fix the real problem underneath, which is that inhibition. So we need to do more than just strengthening exercises. And so one of the ways we can go about doing that is using different modalities to help restore the neuromuscular control. And so in this study here, you can see we have a control, a TENS unit, and a cryotherapy group. So what occurred is they tested them with that H reflex we described previously. There, higher is less inhibition. All right, so more volitional control, what we like. So they tested them before and then right after they injected their knee with a bunch of fluid. And that we know that knee or fluid, again, it's just saline. There's no injury to the knee, just swelling associated with that. And immediately after, they basically stayed the same. They then applied a 30-minute treatment. And this is what they normally see. And then the control, they did nothing, right? You can see here, basically the same, but then the swelling inhibits the muscle activation to protect the knee joint itself, right? Because the body doesn't know that the knee is just swollen, it's not injured. But after a 30-minute TENS treatment thing, you can see it basically negated and kept that fairly consistent. Whereas in the ice situation, right, we actually get an increase in there. And some of that can be due to a variety of different things. But what we do know is that simply doing ice over the anterior and posterior aspects of the joint for 20 minutes gives us a 40-minute window where we can do exercises using the entire availability of our motor units. And so by using those during that window, we're training and the ability to overcome those inhibitory interneurons, thereby decreasing the amount of inhibition long term. Electrical stimulation in the same sort of realm as well. Right? And so, with this, also in their pain-free exercises aimed at enhancing these periods of neuromuscular control are recommended, even though we're not as certain as why. So our basic component here, hitting each one of these as far as how we can go about restoring neuromuscular control. What we'll see here in the saying that's become popular with the inhibition researchers is treat the joint, fire the muscle. The idea that, right, we're not going to ice or put TENS on the muscle we're trying to use. We're going to go to the source of the inhibition, which is the injured joint itself. So ice bags, 20 minutes over the joint where the injury is, and then perform the exercises. In TENS, you can do everything from wearing it continuously. So I've seen in some situations that after a knee surgery, they would just wear a TENS unit continuously on a strong sensory level to just try to increase the blocking of the sensation of the pain and the swelling, thereby cutting off the signals that then are stimulating the inhibitory neurons, which are then inhibiting the motor units, right? And so, or you can do it just during exercise as well. Another area to consider is biofeedback. And biofeedback is that process of detecting physiological activity in the body by converting it to visual or auditory cues. These are those packs with the electrodes. They're passive. You put them on the muscle and it measures the amount of muscle electrical activity and puts it in a situation where usually it goes from like green to red or red to green with that as you increase the amount of muscle electrical activity. So that way you can see how much muscle activity is being produced opposed to just the amount of strength. You can also do it to decrease neuromuscular activity in muscle relaxation sort of aspects, but really what we're looking at here is to delay or reduce atrophy by increasing muscle strength by increasing neuromuscular activity. So if we set this to a point where, okay, you have to the athlete or patient has to really try hard to contract that muscle maximally, right, and activate as many motor units as possible in order to get the required muscle electrical activity, we can then get to a situation where we put that as the baseline, and each one of their quad set reps, so to speak, requires them to fully activate that for it to count, right? So that gives them more feedback than just do it as hard as possible, right? Now you're trying to increase the muscle activation. And so again, this is a specific area of pain management, right? As far as the idea of using pain management as one of the causes of a lack of neuromuscular control, right? But also then just for its own sake, understanding the three components of neuromuscular control, that being volitional contraction, proprioception and reflex response, and then putting that all together in complex motor patterns towards the end of the rehabilitation plan. And so most of that is relatively normal, right? We've always done balance exercises. We've always done sport-specific training, but making sure that we're adding to our rehabilitation plans that restoration of volitional control and specifically trying to overcome the muscle inhibition opposed to just focusing on pure strength gains is important to make sure we are giving the athlete the best possibility, because that inhibition that we've seen in studies often is present for years after, even after ACL reconstruction, even after they've returned to participation. That inhibition is still elevated in most patients, and that might be part of what's leading to the increased prevalence of osteoarthritis. Again, that link hasn't been completely established, but we do know that ACL patients are more likely to suffer osteoarthritis regardless of whether or not they have their knee reconstructed. And we also know that they have persistent inhibition. And so if we can work towards eliminating that inhibition, we can improve knee function long-term and improve long-term patient outcomes.